Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello, and welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, where we talk about all those things that are imaginary, science fiction, fantasy, weird things, other things that aren't those, us sometimes. And today we are going to tackle one of the largest topics in science fiction. Spaceships, without which a whole lot of science fiction would not exist. And we're going to range far afield. We are going to ask a lot of questions that seem like they're disconnected. We are not going to cover everything there is to cover in our usual 45 minutes, but certainly we're going to talk a lot about spaceships today. So, come along with us, and I hope you enjoy it.
Yes.
So where should we start, do you think?
I think we should start with the elephant in the room,
Sure.
which is, of course, the big two. And by big two, I mean the film and television franchises that immediately leap to mind when we think of spaceships, which is, of course, Star Trek and Star Wars. Both of these are shows that feature ships as important elements in the story, both as plot devices to get you from point A to point B, and also as characters. The USS, it's USS, right, for the Enterprise? The
It is.
USS Enterprise and the Millennium Falcon, specifically, are perhaps the most iconic ships from each series, although, as we discussed in our last podcast, the Discovery is also a very important character in its series. It has Sporp, after all.
It does. Yeah. And so are all the ships in Star Trek, whatever the series might be, even Deep Space Nine, which is primarily set on a space station. And aside, I should say, this is the first podcast in another small series of podcasts, and we will be tackling space stations in a subsequent podcast. But Deep Space Nine, even though it's set on a space station, the Defiant, when they introduced that in the third season of Deep Space Nine, I think, becomes an integral part of that show. So,
yeah, absolutely. I mean, Star Trek has a trend, if not a rule, that the series is named after the ship upon which events unfold, with the exception of Deep Space Nine and
Next
Generation. But those are also series which basically incorporate these ships as important characters in the story.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
And I think part of the reason why Star Trek did it in the first place, because I can think of, there were plenty of serials, plenty of pulp novels, plenty of Golden Age sci-fi that had spaceships, but when I think of, network television, the kind of show that could really bring what a spaceship looked like to a lot of people, like actually into their homes, I think Star Trek, the original series, really set that precedent. And really, I don't know that Gene Roddenberry set out to make a show that was set so centrally around and on a starship. Certainly, it was an integral part of it, but I also think that a lot of it was budget. Like, it's easier to make these sets that you can use in every episode because, all the characters are on the bridge or all the characters are in their quarters or whatever. And certainly I know one anecdote is that one of the reasons why they invented, air quotes, the transporter in Star Trek was so they didn't have to show the ship landing. They didn't have to go with kind of like, the typical shuttle or even like rocket ship that could like actually set down on the planet, because it would be expensive to show that happening like week after week when they went to new alien planets. So kind of thinking like from the behind the scenes, what we think of as a spaceship on screen, certainly on a television screen, was kind of informed way back when, and still is certainly to some degree, by budget. So what we see is what we can do and what we can pay
get,
for.
essentially.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's an interesting point, because my reasons for bringing up those specific examples is not because I want us to spend all of our time talking about Star Trek and Star Wars on this particular episode, but to point out that the seminal space operas that we point to as kind of the heart of the larger nebula of space opera literature and film out there, they started this trend of focusing in on ships. And while some later space operas, and I'm thinking like Cameron Hurley's latest book, The Stars Are Legion, they really go a completely different direction. But in general, space operas have stayed pretty close to the ship as a plot device or as a character. And, Starship Troopers does it, and Lucky does it. There's even like I'm doing enormous air quotes here because we've talked about my problems with using the word hard sci-fi as a term, but even in the quote-unquote hard sci-fi, films and books that are coming out, the ship has remained central or important. So in The Expanse, the Rocinante, this is considered a somewhat hard science fictional show and series. The Rocinante remains an important figure in the books, even though they kind of have to do a little bit of gymnastics in order to make that happen. Or I should say they have to split off a plot line that, travels on the Rocinante in order to keep a ship central to the plot. So, I think that if we look at ships as a fundamental aspect of the space opera that has persisted in other parts of the science fictional genre, that might give us a good place to start. What do you think?
Well, that gets into this idea of ships as cities in space, where basically you have an entire population of, people who have multiple jobs, hierarchies, maybe under a captain, a mayor, administrator, a manager, depending upon, the framing of the universe. But a lot of the Culture series by Ian M. Banks, a lot of the larger ships in Star Trek, a lot of the larger ships in Star Wars. You noted that Ann Leckie's Ancillary series does this. So getting to that point in a lot of space operas where the ships are just so large that they basically become home for our characters. And I want to add to that this idea that has been bouncing around for as long as I think there have been spaceships, that space is an ocean. And spaceships are the actual, direct counterparts or complements to ocean-going ships, where, maybe they're shot like ships or submarines if you are looking at them on screen, whether that's in a movie or on a television screen, or in a book, they're referred to using naval terms, or you use words that you recognize, where the author uses words that the reader might recognize from ships that would go on the ocean. Words like cruiser or schooner or battleship or carrier
or dreadnought class.
And a lot of those, or dreadnought, right? And a lot of those are like military or pseudo-military, hence like the comparison to submarines. But this idea that especially on screen, space is just this vast ocean waiting to be trawled and explored and battled in by these ocean ship analogs is something that I think has informed a lot of science fiction. I almost wanted to say dogged a lot of science fiction because I think that it can be a kind of a crutch sometimes to, think about, for example, if you are a filmmaker thinking about shooting a boat, whether that boat or ship, sorry, I know that if you like boats or ships, that you're probably like really offended by me putting those two things together. But like whether you're shooting on film the Titanic, or an old fucking Life of Pi, where you have a little rowboat or something, like that boat or that ship is moving in 2 dimensions, except for the Titanic, but that was an accident. In space, you got one more dimension than that, but because we're so used to seeing ships on the surface of the water, or even for submarines, mostly moving laterally and kind of only awkwardly moving up and down, I think a lot of the times space gets treated like, it's 2-dimensional and the ships are moving kind of right across the surface. Right. And that's on screen can be a detriment to storytelling, and yet something that makes the audience feel familiar.
Well, and it's so foundational to military style science fiction that there be flotillas and whatnot of ships in formation, and really the only variation visually upon existing military formations is that you might have rows up and down as well as sideways. And
Right.
like this reminds me of Ender's Game a lot, where they do play with this idea of what does a formation actually look like in 3 dimensions. And I know that a lot of people point to the series, like the enemy's gates, down kind of line as like really formative in them understanding space as a 3-dimensional space. Space is a 3-dimensional space. But like I think we could throw another spanner in the works and mention that for a lot of these books and movies and television shows, space is actually a 4-dimensional place to move through, because so many of these ships use FTL drives or warp or whatnot, and they're using some sort of MacGuffin or gimmick in order to travel through the 4th dimension, time, in order to get from point A to point B. So that adds another possibility into design that I don't think I've seen any ships on screen, at least, take advantage of. Like, what does a ship that travels through time have, or architecturally, that like a actual ship in Earth's on Earth in the ocean would require? Like, like there's a lot more than just like a regular standard engine that's going to be required to do that kind of work. So I would love to see, going forward, this is my challenge to you directors of the universe who are listening to this podcast, I would love to see innovation on design, specifically with this time going, essentially, this time going aspect of space travel. So anyway, that was a very rambly way of saying, don't limit yourself to thinking of space as a 3-dimensional, space.
Right. And I think that works a lot better in books than it does on screen, simply because in books we can, you can, as an author, describe battle scenes that have movement on multiple axes in multiple directions at once, and you're just sort of building a picture for your reader. On screen, there's a certain familiarity that your audience might expect, and that's hard really to kind of fuck around
it's a kind
with,
of visual shorthand, and I think the show and there are ways to do this right. Like, we're not saying that it's lazy storytelling to do this necessarily. You might be focusing on something else, like social structure in this universe, rather than the military formations of your fighters. But like Battlestar Galactica really perfected the art of a fairly conventional space warfare scenario. And I actually really fucking love the alien base stars on the show, because they make no architectural sense whatsoever. Like, how do they travel somehow, obviously. And that I do not get how that happens with the structure you're showing us on screen, but I get that it would look different from the standard military vehicle kind of fighter pilot things that the I don't want to say good guys, because that shifts during the show, that the Earthlings, or not even Earthlings, oh my goodness, what are they called?
Humans?
The humans?
I forget. I don't know.
Who fucking knows? That show was good, but it was focusing on other things than... I mean, the ships were important characters, but they were like... They were meant to be visual shorthand for this as a familiar place emotionally and whatnot.
Right. And I think it's also useful to remember that the big two that you mentioned, Star Trek and Star Wars, when they started, like, the design for the Enterprise, where you had, like, this saucer and then this bottom part and these nacelles that were also the engines, or, like, in Star Wars, like, the Millennium Falcon kind of looking like a hockey puck with a mouth, and the Star Destroyers were big triangles, and, like, these ships were departures from what had been seen before. Like, they were very much not the pulpy rocket ships, or even, like, the kind of, like, city ships, or the other ideas that were around. Like, I'm thinking here of Arthur C. Clarke's Rendezvous with Rama, which had, a very different idea of what ships might look like, and yet was different, again, from what they ended up looking like on screen in the 50s, 60s, 70s, etc.
Yeah, and I would really point out, so I visited the Denver Museum of Nature and Science while I was in Denver for a training recently, and they have this, space exhibit. I think it's a permanent exhibit, and as a part of that exhibit, they actually have this park your very own space shuttle using like a surface that's kind of like an air hockey table. So the idea is that you're trying to park in zero gravity. Now, it's not really a perfect rendition because you're not working in 3 dimensions, you're working on a flat surface. But even so, the reduction, or the I'm doing air quotes here, the removal of friction alone made it impossible to park these damn shuttles. And I spent like a full half hour glaring at this machine trying to park a damn shuttle. And like a 12-year-old came up and tried, and that 12-year-old did better than I did. But there's something to say for the fact that We don't see a lot of the actual mechanics of realistic spaceflight happen on screen. Specifically, we read a lot more about that, I think.
Yeah.
And we tend to read about it mostly in hard sci-fi. So I think there's a lot of visual shorthand that makes plot work for a 45-minute television show. Like, we can't spend forever showing the mechanics of how you get your spacecraft to move in the right direction and stop.
Right.
And stop in space. Like, stopping in space is an issue for me. Just saying.
Yeah. Right.
Anyway.
But actually, you're bringing up, because we mentioned it a couple of times now, this difference between ships we do and can see on screen versus the ships that appear in prose that we can read about. So maybe let's talk a little bit about some other differences that we see there. Because I think that there are a suite of differences. Certainly depends upon the work, the time of the work, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the things that I would like to mention is that ships on screen need to stop being so gray.
Aw. Well, I think that when we see on-screen ships becoming something other than gray, and I'm thinking of two specific scenes, well, kind of three. There's two scenes in Serenity, the movie follow-up to Firefly, that show the ship Serenity being redecorated. And then there's a scene, I think, in The Expanse, I think it might be in the second season or the first season, where they're basically like disguising the ship and repainting it and whatnot. This happened in Star Trek Discovery too. So the whole like repainting of the USS Discovery signage on it.
Yeah.
And those are always really important but brief moments in film and television. Like, they symbolize something. In almost all three examples, it symbolizes like the ship becoming the possession of its occupants, in a sense.
Right.
So I think, we haven't seen color as just like color. We've seen color and splashes of color as symbol.
Right, I agree. I think there's a lot of visual coding that goes on. Like when I think of Star Trek, the Klingons, for example, have green ships. Well, up until Discovery. Discovery kind of changed things around. The Romulans, also after Next Generation, tended to have green ships. The Borg, black ships. Same thing on Babylon 5. If you saw a ship that was powder blue, it belonged to the Minbari. If it was purple, it belonged to the Centauri. So there's a lot of I think that there is a lot of easy visual cueing that you can get on screen from colors, from lights, from patterns that help, in the sort of like grand operatic scene that you're going to get in a lot of space operas, when you're trying to tell okay, there are many dozens, potentially hundreds of ships on screen. How do I know what belongs to whom? And beyond that, thinking more of just which ships belong to which government, which organization, which species, whatever. The ability to actually incorporate the modification of that ship to make it more meaningful to one character or multiple characters or a crew is something that can work out in the way that you said.
And it's not like the designers behind the visuals of Star Trek and Star Wars were not conscious of the role of color. They too dabble in it just on a very monolithic scale. So the Empire is always white, gray, or black. Like their Super Star Destroyers are black. Ooh, scary! It's the scariest of all Super Star Destroyers. Whatever. And then in Star Trek, the Discovery is the first USS ship that I've seen that is not the standard silvery color. I know that is a little different with Voyager. I remember seeing a shot of the Voyager ship recently and thinking, oh, there is a little bit more going on with the design there than I thought. But the visuals of these shows are very well thought out. It does seem like a shame to not reflect the spectrum of color on screen, but I think it's not the point, and they don't want to invest maybe the time that would be required to do the detailing in CGI. I don't know what the reasons might be. I would love for anyone who does know to chime in at this point and help me out a little bit. Is this intentional, or is it meeting budget requirements for design?
Certainly. I mean, I think it's probably both, depending upon the ship, the show, the movie, et cetera, et cetera. But, I feel like the converse is, for prose, ships in prose, they don't necessarily have that.
They don't have the restriction, but they are always gray or black as well.
Well, not necessarily,
Usually.
but I'm thinking too that, like, you know, you don't necessarily have the same sort of, oh, that ship is blue, therefore it belongs to this alliance, that you do in, well, I mean, if you were looking at it, you have many fewer senses to play with as a prose author than you do as a showrunner or a movie maker, and that can, you know, that can be awesome because your ships can do things that physical models or even CGI couldn't do so easily, or could do, but it would be really expensive and time consuming, and you could just write it. But on the other hand, again, you don't have those visual cues, you don't have the auditory cues, you don't have even, you know, because we're thinking of ships potentially fulfilling a lot of roles here, but one of the important roles that they fulfill is setting for our human or non-human characters. So, you know, all of the sensory sensations that go along with that, what it feels like to actually be inside that ship, what it feels like to smell with, well, what does that ship smell like? This leads into another point that I want to hit.
Well, it leads into the ships. Like, I would just first point out that all of our conversation about ships being black and gray and whatnot, we're talking about the outside of the ship in that case. Like, it's a shame that they're not more colorful on the outside when we know that all of these ships are super colorful on the inside. Just wanted to clarify. We know that the Firefly, Serenity, all of these shows have super colorful interiors and we love them. So, back to you.
Yes, totally. So, from whose perspective are we seeing our ships? Whether we're actually looking at them on a screen or reading about them in a book. Basically, you know, where do we go? Where can we go? What do we know? Like, when we see, for example, establishing shots in Star Trek of the Enterprise entering warp or dropping out of warp, or a space battle in Star Wars or something, like, we are not the character in those moments. We are people who are witnessing this, you know, empty space suddenly being full of ships that are doing things to each other or on their own or whatever, but, like, you know, our perspective is very much from the outside looking at this thing that is arriving with lots of people in it. But obviously, you know, once we move into the ship, and we can talk more about outside as well, but once we move into the ship, how do we actually know what it is to be within that mobile whatever it is?
Well, skipping back 30 seconds to the establishing shots question. When there is a break from that tradition of, like, the inanimate, I guess, random space dust perspective of what's going on and what the ship looks like from the outside, when shows or when shows or movies break from that visually, it can be a really powerful moment. And I'm thinking of in the reboot of Star Trek, the movie reboot, when Kirk is driving his motorcycle and he's just been beat up in the bar or whatever, and he's driving his motorcycle and he sees the Enterprise being constructed on Earth. We are seeing it from his perspective, and it really is like a great emotional moment for me in that film. It's one of my favorite bits of the whole film, is seeing the unfinished Enterprise on Earth before it's lofted out, I guess, off the surface. And, you know, it's visually powerful. So, like, there are moments and times when shows break from that. But again, they're doing it as symbolism. They're doing it to emphasize that this is a special moment. It's not like a standard. With the interiors of the ship, usually, I've noticed in, again, film and television, usually there's some sort of sequence where you're following a character through the ship, through multiple levels. Firefly did this really, really well. I think there's a couple scenes in Star Trek Discovery that do the same thing, where you're following one character or a robot or something through the various levels. And you kind of get glimpses of people at work in the various places on the ship, and it kind of establishes the aesthetic and the feel of living and working in this confined space, and all the different microcosms that exist within that larger space. And that's kind of a cool move. I wish it was used more often later in shows, because it's kind of like a once and done thing usually when you see it. So, it's like, you know how in Pride and Prejudice, the 2005 Pride and Prejudice, there is a scene, I want to say midway through the movie, where the camera follows in a bunch of different characters through a bunch of different scenes, but the camera never cuts away, and it just follows these characters through the entire mansion, and you're seeing, again, the same microcosm. Well, that was really cool because they were doing it halfway through the movie instead of just at the beginning. And I wish that in science fiction we saw more of that, because despite having, like, a 2-second glimpse of all the different workstations at the beginning of a series, I kind of want to see what that's like under pressure, and when it's a really
Yeah.
boring day, and other things like that. Like, it would be pretty cool for me personally. I
Right.
don't know if other people would like
Yeah.
it. I would like that.
Yeah.
And I'm selfish, so
Mm-hmm.
I want it. I want it now. Thank you very much. So I
Yeah.
think when we're looking at the insides of ships, we tend to have one or two scenes like that where you're following a character, and then you, after that, tend to have static shots throughout the ship.
Yeah.
And that's interesting to me. I don't know what's psychologically going on there, but that's the thing.
Right. Well, it's sort of like, you know what you're dealing with. Kind of, way back to the beginning of the podcast when I said that thing about you have the sets built, you know where your characters are going to be. Like, they're known locations. You have a certain number of known locations. Like, it's kind of like in the same way that if we're watching a sitcom, like, we know, the living room where the characters gather, if it's a family sitcom, or like the dining room, or like, if it's like, if they're living together, we know everything about the apartment, Jerry's apartment in Seinfeld, as an example.
Yeah.
Like, it's kind of like these are the sets. These are the places that our characters find most meaningful and where they spend most of their time within the universe of the show. Outside the universe of the show, it's what the budget could do. Like, these are the things that at the beginning of the show or later on as they add more sets.
Did you ever watch The West Wing?
Never did.
Did you ever watch Steve Jobs with a screenplay by Sorkin?
I did.
So,
yes, that I did watch.
so he also did The West Wing, and so the parallel stands if you saw that movie. Sorkin does a great job of, again, not really cutting away as often as a lot of other directors do, and following characters in conversation through a number of different sets. And I think like that move is underused as like a storytelling device at large in cinema.
Yeah.
And it's really cool when you see it work in the hands of someone with the skill of a Sorkin. I don't universally love Sorkin and everything he does, but that specific move and his dialogue is so sharp that it works, because you do need the dialogue to be sharp if you're going to follow, two or more characters on a conversation throughout their set. So perhaps one of the obstacles to seeing more of that kind of work in science fiction is that, in general, science fiction hasn't managed to attract the caliber of writers. And this is as a rule. There are exceptions to this rule, but they haven't managed to attract the caliber of scriptwriters as maybe some of these individual films where we see that done really, really well. I don't know. I like the scriptwriters for a lot of these shows. I think that they're gifted. That's just not one of their specific tools in their toolbox.
So let's talk a little bit about ships as actual speaking characters, which can absolutely happen on screen.
Yeah.
But what about when the ship is seeing the ship from its own perspective, when we're getting reflection on the part of the ship, when the ship can think through like who I is.
Sure.
Ignore the grammar of that statement, but basically there's the inward gaze, like the ship looking at itself. And again, I know you're my Anne Leckie go-to person for the Ancillary series, but I also want to throw in for your consideration Becky Chambers' books.
Yes, Long Way to Small Angry Planet, and what was the sequel?
A Closed and Common Orbit. A Closed and Common Orbit. And in the case of A Closed and Common Orbit, it's pretty much entirely from the perspective of an artificial intelligence who was once the ship, was the ship from the first book, The Wayfarer, and then became Lovelace when she moved out on her own in a humanoid body. But that's the kind of thing that prose allows us to do, I think, because I cannot think off the top of my head of either a show or a movie that includes as an integral thinking, speaking main character a ship. I can certainly think of the ship as like a character, like here's an additional character. It is the Enterprise, it is the Rocinante, it is Serenity, but as far as like someone who the characters actually have conversations with, and granted they talk to the computer in Star Trek, but I mean more than that.
Well, it's somewhat of a fine distinction, but a lot of the access we have to ships as characters, as like characters with sentience, is through an AI. And in a lot of these books, and I'm including in here Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, in which there is a very fruitful and interesting conversation between a human character and a ship's AI. Sometimes there is confusion between the ship and the ship's AI, and sometimes the AI operates independently of the ship. In Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, that is a much closer connection. They're kind of one and the same. Like, the ship may be the hardware, but the AI is the software, essentially, and they are therefore inseparable if you want to have a functioning ship. And the same can be said for a lot of other sci-fi narratives. And I'm thinking, because I love talking about Anne Leckie, one of the things that's really unique and special about the ancillary series is that, especially in the first book, which I think is the strongest showing, even though like all of the books are great, what killed me are so dead and I loved about that first book was that the AI of the ship had become separated from the hardware, essentially. And in future scenes, it kind of grapples with, what am I if I'm not the ship anymore? And so the difference between being an AI and being the hardware, or being both, becomes like the heart and soul of the plot. And that's a really interesting move. And I mean, it's not just about a grasp for human style life. It's also about like, what does it mean to be hardware and software? And when we step back for a moment and consider that the ancillary series was written by someone who is a part of the disability community of writers, it becomes even more interesting because we have this whole parallel to conversations about the human body in relation to like the human mind or the human soul, and expectations versus the lived-in reality. I think that the ancillary series is just a really, really rich avenue to discuss some of these questions about what is a body and what is the body's relationship to the whole person, and you know what is disability and what is disease, so on and so forth. And I love that Anne Leckie found another way to have that conversation and buried it deep within this, you know, really fascinating for other reasons story. Like, it's a compulsively readable book to me, and all of those other conversations were stewing in the background, but they weren't like, it wasn't preaching any one message, and that was really, really neat. So I think that when we look at ships and AIs and ships as characters in science fiction, like that have a voice of their own, I think we have so many possibilities, and we've only just begun to scratch the surface of those. And I think some of the more contemporary explorations, like maybe one of the older ones that I personally have read is, watched, is 2001: A Space Odyssey. And
that's an excellent example.
Yeah, and so then there again you have an AI that begins to do its own thing, and that's a little bit less compelling of a complex exploration of what AI is, or like what a ship can be. But it was the beginning, maybe, of this ever deepening and ever enriching conversation. So I don't know what other older stories there are about machine intelligence, but I would point to 2001: A Space Odyssey as the oldest that I personally remember well.
Yeah, I can't believe I didn't think about that. That's a great example. But exactly, when the ship is partially a setting, partially somewhere where the characters actually are located in time and space, but also so much more than that. Something that is absolutely a character in its own right. And has to, not in the way of Anne Leckie's ships or even what's going on with Lovelace in A Closed and Common Orbit, but integral nonetheless, and integral to the story, that it has its own agency, that it can do things.
And when you contrast it to like the hardest of hard sci-fi narratives that we have on screen or off, so The Martian is a great example because it's both book and movie, and its ship operates plot-wise and functionally exactly the same way in book and movie. I mean, it's a cool and dazzling setting. It's got really big windows that are very impractical if you think about micrometeorites, but apart from that, it's basically where shit gets done. It's not really in and of itself a character or a participant in the narrative, apart from providing a few more like obstacles to be overcome or challenges to be solved. And I find that fine, because if you go into the story and there's enough other things going on to hold your interest. But in terms of like what's happening with the ship, that's a lot less interesting to me than a 2001: A Space Odyssey or an Anne Leckie or any number of other ship-based space operas, I guess.
Yeah. Well, let's pivot that question a little bit. So we see ships from different perspectives.
Yes.
We see them, kind of like from the objective, air quotes, objective perspective of, the ship arriving in space, the ship being in space. We see it from the perspective of human or humanoid or otherwise meat sentient, or I don't know, you throw some datas in there, you got some droids maybe, and they're seeing it too. So you have those perspectives inside the ship, maybe moving back and forth from inside to outside, etc., or you have the perspective of the ship itself. But all of that said, all of that we have said already, let's think about actually being on that ship, those characters that are on and read on as within that ship. In a lot of cases, those characters are there because it's their job.
Sure.
Because whatever their job is, they accomplish it either actually on the ship or by moving from port to port, location to location. And so being on the ship is, integral to the story because they need to get from story point to story point. So I think that's so prevalent, and yet is expressed in so many different ways. You have, for example, military or pseudo-military like you have in Star Trek, like you have in Battlestar Galactica. You have civilian transports like in Firefly. You have generational ships or ships.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that. Like, what would you say a River Solomon, like An Unkindness of Ghosts, her book, what would you say that how does that kind of a ship, a generational ship, and there is this whole like subgenre of science fiction, which is the generational ship, which is breaking down, and is an analog for something else. Like in River Solomon's book, it's an analog for the antebellum South. There's a lot of like class-based literature in science fiction that's based on generational ships that are breaking down. So like, how does that intersect with what you're saying?
So I think we can put all of what we've said together to sort of answer that question, because in a book like An Unkindness of Ghosts, or like Adrian Tchaikovsky's Children of Time, where you have generational ships, where you have social strife, either manifesting over time or having manifested over time, and our characters experience that, it showcases both that the ship is a city that houses a lot of people that themselves change over time as you have actual generational progression. You have this idea of the ship as a location, both in terms of where it's going and where it's been, because in both of those and many other examples, it's a generational ship because it's going to take a long time, maybe because the universe is one in which there is no MacGuffin to overcome the light speed barrier, so the ship has to get there going very slowly. So you have the ship appearing, to move very slowly, to be a city as it's getting there, to slowly replace its population, and to know it from that angle. And that's really interesting as well. The ship sort of as culmination of all of those different things, but also as analogy on its own, as in, a river of ghosts, kind of.
A river of ghosts.
As an actual river of ghosts. True. I was going to say as kind of like an avatar of racial.
You mean An Unkindness of Ghosts? I'm assuming.
Yes. Sorry. What did I say?
A River of Ghosts. I mean, it is by River Solomon.
An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think the metaphor aspect is played up a lot in generational ships. What I haven't seen a lot of in generational ships, apart from Kim Stanley Robinson's Aurora, is a great deal of attention to functionally how do you get this thing to work.
Yeah.
Usually the go-to is to skip all that and focus on the metaphor rather than focusing on the ship as like an actual system that needs maintenance and requires systems to operate nominally in order to function. That kind of a thing. That doesn't seem to happen, especially in young adult sci-fi, I would say. Like, they tend to skip straight to metaphor almost every time. Yeah.
Which is unfortunate because I think you can do both. And not to say that is unilaterally unfortunate, but can you have a really interesting, maybe even unique ship that is, that you can have characters or just, the third party kind of impartial voice exploring at the same time that it functions as a metaphor. I think that that's true. I can't think off the top of my head of an example where I can see that that's been really well done. Maybe the closest that I can get to is the Nostromo from Alien.
That's a good point.
Because you have, the ship is both it's trying to establish that there's this flying factory in space. And it's not even a factory, it's more like a flying warehouse, I guess. And so you get that at the same time, and this was, 79 when Alien came out, so obviously there were new things going on screen, but you also have this imagery that's at work. You have these metaphors that are at play, these analogies that are trying to recall like the mansion of horror films where you're trapped in kind of an enclosed space and you can't get out, and something is hunting you. And I know that's I'm calling that horror films, and I know that goes back way farther than horror films. But maybe that's a decent example of something that is both metaphor trying to make you think of something else, but also unique in its own way as an actual spaceship that is first and foremost not just a metaphor.
I think that's interesting. Yeah. So when it comes to spaceships, I know that we kind of went into this podcast with a lot of names on the tips of our tongue.
We did, but if you're going where I think you're going, then I think it's time to bring up some of our favorites that we haven't gotten a chance to talk about yet.
Yes, so looking at our list, I see a lot of familiar names. Revenger, we've talked about as a favorite. Both of us really enjoyed it, and Revenger, the book, made our list of best books of 2017. This is by Alistair Reynolds, and Revenger is also the name of the ship, one of the ships that features in that book, and it's a very cool ship. So I think we can agree that that's cool. But there's a couple of names on your list that I'm not familiar with. I'm not familiar with Star Control or Space Trawler. What the heck are these things?
So far, we have talked about movies, we've talked about TV shows, we've talked about books. Let me introduce video games and webcomics into our mix. So Star Control is a video game that I love. You guys have maybe heard me talk about it before. Space Trawler is a webcomic that had a long run several years ago, wrapped up its main story, went on hiatus, published hard copy the entire run, and then was reborn with a new cast of a kind of new cast of characters. But I mentioned both of them because Star Control is a great example of, to me, because it's one of the first games that I played, of a large cast of ships. You had one ship per alien species that you encountered, and you encountered, in the original game, I think it was 14, and in the second game it was 25, so you had many unique ships. They were colorful, they were weird, they didn't make any sense. Like, you had one ship that was literally just several different colored balls, like, attached to each other in haphazard fashion. So Star Control really set my bar pretty high as far as what ships could look like and how they didn't have to look at all like your expectation. And a lot of the ships in Star Control were call-outs to other things, were references to, old pulpy ships, to Golden Age science fiction.
Well, speaking of call-outs, I mean, another one on your list is Heart of Gold, which reminds me that there's an episode of Firefly called Heart of Gold, which I'm only now getting as a reference to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. So congratulations, Kendra, you dunderhead.
You did
I
it.
did it. I got there. But it is interesting to me that like the ships themselves become shorthand for stories, and I'm not just talking about like Firefly and Serenity. That's a great example because Serenity is the name of the movie, and it's a Firefly class ship. So like the ship has made it into the names of both television series and movie. But like this is a fairly common thing where like we'll be like, oh, it's the one that has the Rocinante, or the one that has, Voyager, or you might even name the whole television show after it, whatever. And in an enclosed and common orbit, Lovelace has become like one of, I'm guessing, I haven't read the second book, but one of the central characters of the series. And if you say it's the one with Lovelace, people are going to know what you mean.
Yeah. Right. And I want to give a final shout out to Space Trawler again, because right there in the name is in the same way as you have Star Trek Voyager. Space Trawler is about, it's about many things, but it features as a central plot concern over the first arc of the comic, what space trawlers are and where they come from, and how they're made, how it's kind of actually awful. I'm going to try and not ruin this for anyone, but I will say if you're looking for something to read / look at that takes this idea of ships and makes it really, really central, and gets at everything from how do they move faster than light to what does it take to actually create a ship. Space Trawler is where you should go.
I'm going. You can count on it. I now obviously need to read this series, so I'm on it. I would also point out we haven't talked a great deal about regular comics, but one of my favorite portrayals of a ship in comics is the ship in Saga, which Saga is also one of our best ofs from 2017, the volume that came out last year. And it features a ship that is also a tree, which is very interesting. Oh, yeah.
Sweet.
It's super cool. So if you're looking for like a visually attractive ship that maybe doesn't make so much sense functionally, but is a character in the series and is also, it defies standard architecture for ships, I would go with Saga. Very, very interesting. And of course, the rest of the story is amazing as well. And I would also point out that Spaceman of Bohemia features a very interesting ship that's very important to the series, and not the series, to the book. And we have discussed Spaceman of Bohemia at length in its own podcast, so I'd point you back towards that. But my final ship that I would mention is Terminal Alliance. In Terminal Alliance, I should say, which is the Jim C. Hines Space Janitors book. And I just love this book to bits, not just because we have a cool ship or two, but because we have characters who are involved in maintaining it at the most basic levels. You know, like we don't often get the perspective of the janitor and what it takes to clean and, you know, I guess whatever they do to clean out the toilets in these ship or, you know, unplug drains or rewire things. I love that perspective because it gives you a sense of the guts of the ship in a way that you don't often get. Even when you're inside of a ship, you don't often get the actual guts of the ship. So Terminal Alliance is unique in that way. So looking forward to the next book in that series. I think it comes out next year. So anything else that you can think of that we've missed?
Well, I'm going to mic drop with my final example here. And it is from The Three Body Problem. And it is, spoiler alert, when towards the end of the book, you have the entire Space Navy from Earth lined up in this flotilla that is arranged in 3 dimensions. He makes very clear that it is that this the orientation of this fleet is trying to, you know, actually move out through all of space in all of the dimensions available to them, and it gets fucking clobbered by one tiny alien ship. One ship wipes out the entire fleet, and it's such an unexpected moment, so heartbreaking, so well done, and yet so just like you. I was primed as a reader to think, oh no, well the ship's going to get away, or it's not going to be able to destroy all of them, or something's going to change, or nope, it is literally just ship destruction on a grand scale, and it changes the course of that book and the books that follow. It's the first in that trilogy. And it's all about what happens to this fleet of ships.
That whole series is fascinating in its approach to what you can and cannot do with your characters and with your plot. So yeah, I also don't think I can describe it in too much detail without completely ruining it, but by the end of the book, you've had this complete emotional turnaround from what you were expecting, like 2/3 or 3/4 of the way through. So highly recommend at least the first book. I have not yet finished the others because they are big and there are other books on my list, but I will get to the rest of those. And those are by Cixin Liu, or I don't know. Anyway, look him up. Fantastic books.
Yeah. And with that, I believe it is time for us to board our own ships and blast on out of here. So, do you want to tell our kind listeners where you can find us?
Indeed. So, we always recommend that you run by our website, which is www.imaginaries.net. We try to keep our currently reading lists somewhat up to date, although even if we don't update, for 5 days, we end up with a completely new list when we do. So I highly recommend following us on there. We are going to be, as we mentioned last time, putting up more original content. So you're going to see some reviews from me over the next couple of weeks. And you're also going to see, hopefully, some YouTube videos from Tony over the next couple of weeks, which is going to be awesome. So look at our website. Also, our awards lists are on there, and they're still a great place to start if you're looking for some new science fiction.
Yeah.
You can also find us on Twitter, and we would love for you to do that because you can actually interact with us there, in theory. And we, our handle is imaginary_pod. And let's see, you can find us on YouTube, our back episodes, which we are trying to update at present. And you can also find us on SoundCloud and iTunes, where you can follow us and review us. Please do that because we need some reviews. And you guys are awesome, and we're awesome, so we should make sure that everybody knows that everything to do with this podcast is awesome. Everything is awesome.
Is awesome.
Yeah.